Welcome to Lady Mythos. There's an ancient Egyptian story about a goddess who was created to protect the world. Within days, she started hunting humans instead. Not just the rebels, not just the guilty. Everyone. And the strange part is, no one could stop her. Not the priests, not the other gods, not even the god who created her. Because this wasn't a mistake. She kept going, long after she was supposed to stop. And that's where the story becomes difficult to explain. If you stay with this story, you'll understand how something created to protect life nearly erased it completely. And why, once it began, it didn't want to stop. And before we go further, take a second to like the video, subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of stories, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. This is the story of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of ancient Egypt, a force of war, disease, and healing, a goddess people feared and prayed to in the same breath. But this story doesn't start with her. It starts with something much quieter. A shift. A moment when people began to whisper. Because there was a time when humans lived under the rule of the sun god Ra. And for a long time, that was enough. The sun rose. The Nile flooded. Life continued. Until it didn't. At some point, something changed. Not suddenly, not all at once. People began to question. They spoke more freely when the sun went down. They gathered in small groups. They stopped looking up with the same kind of fear. And slowly, that fear turned into something else. They began to doubt Ra. Not loudly, not openly, but enough. Enough for the god of the sun to notice. And Ra was not what he once was. He was older now, slower, still powerful, but aware that something was slipping. And when a god like Ra begins to feel that, he doesn't wait. He acts. What happened next wasn't a punishment. It wasn't even a war. It was a decision. A single choice that would bring something into the world that no one could take back. And it would begin with his eye. Chapter 1. The Rebellion against Ra. At first, nothing looked different. The sun still rose over the Nile. The water still flooded the land. Crops still grew. From a distance, everything seemed the same. But people had started to change. Quietly. It didn't begin with rebellion. It began with small things. Less bowing, less silence, less fear. When the sun moved across the sky, fewer people stopped to acknowledge it. Fewer hands lifted in prayer. And when night came, they spoke more freely. They gathered in groups, low voices, careful words. Not loud enough to be called defiance, but enough to be noticed. Because doubt doesn't arrive all at once. It spreads, slowly, from one person to another. And for the first time in a long time, people began to question the god above them. Not openly, not yet, But the thought was there, and once it appears, it doesn't leave. They questioned his power. They questioned his rule. Some even began to wonder if he was still watching at all. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because high above them, he was. Ra was watching. He saw the gatherings. He heard the whispers. He felt the change. And what unsettled him wasn't anger. It was recognition. He had seen this before, long before humans existed. The slow return of something older than order, something patient, something that waited for weakness. Chaos. Ra had spent his entire existence holding it back, keeping the world stable, predictable, alive. And now, it was starting again. Not through monsters, not through storms, through people. And Ra understood something immediately. This wouldn't stay small. Because doubt turns into defiance, and defiance into collapse. He could wait. He could ignore it. He could hope it passed. But gods like Ra don't take that risk. So instead of watching, he made a decision. Not to warn them. Not to guide them. Not to forgive them. To correct them. Completely. And to do that, he would need something more than power. He would need something that could act without hesitation. Something that wouldn't question. Something that wouldn't stop halfway. Something that would finish what it started. And in that moment, Ra reached for his eye. Chapter 2. The Creation of Sekhmet. Ra's most dangerous weapon. Ra didn't call for an army. He didn't send storms. He didn't send fire. He chose something far more precise. He chose his eye. In ancient Egypt, the eye of a god wasn't just a part of the body. It was will, power, a force that could leave him and act on its own. And this time, Ra didn't hold it back. He released it. The sky didn't split. There was no thunder, no warning, just a sudden change in the air. Heat building, pressure rising, as if something invisible had just arrived. And then it took form. Not slowly, not gently. One moment, there was only light. The next, there was something standing inside it. A woman's body. Still, balanced, unmoving. And above it, the head of a lioness. Sekhmet. She didn't look around. She didn't hesitate. She already knew why she was there. Because she wasn't born. She was directed. Every part of her had a purpose. To find what had begun to spread. To remove it completely. No hesitation. No doubt. No second thought. Ra didn't explain anything to her. He didn't need to. The command was already inside her. Go. And she did. No sound, no announcement, just movement. She stepped out of the light and into the world. The first people didn't see her coming. They were still talking, still gathering, still whispering. They didn't look up, not until it was too late, because Sekhmet didn't warn. She struck. Fast, clean, direct. One moment, alive, the next, gone. No chaos, no struggle, just silence, where there had been voices seconds before. And then she moved again, from one group to the next. No pattern, no pause, just execution. At first, it worked exactly as intended. The whispers stopped, the gatherings disappeared, the doubt that had begun to spread cut off at the source. And somewhere above, Ra watched. And for a moment, it seemed like the problem had already been solved. But there was something he hadn't accounted for. Something small, easy to miss. The way she didn't slow down. The way she didn't look for who was guilty and who wasn't. The way every movement stayed exactly the same. Precise, efficient, unbroken. And this is where it should have ended. But it didn't. She kept going. Chapter 3. The first sign something was wrong. At first, no one questioned what was happening. The people who had gathered in secret were gone. The whispers had stopped. The tension that had been building disappeared almost overnight. From a distance, it looked like order had been restored, exactly as Ra intended. But the desert doesn't hide things for long. There were too many bodies, too many empty places where people had been just days before. And the pattern didn't make sense. Some of those who disappeared had spoken against Ra, but others hadn't. Some had never questioned anything at all. They had simply been there. And that was the first sign. Because Sekhmet wasn't searching anymore. She wasn't choosing. She was moving. From one place to the next, with the same pace, the same focus, the same precision. Villages that had never rebelled were left silent. Travelers crossing the land vanished without warning. Entire groups disappeared without anyone understanding why. And still, she didn't slow down. There was no hesitation in her movement. No moment where she stopped to decide. No shift in direction. Only continuation. And that's when something began to change. Not in the land, in her. Because at some point, the purpose behind what she was doing stopped mattering. The action remained, but the reason didn't. And that's a dangerous shift. The first time it became visible was subtle, easy to miss. A pause that lasted slightly longer than it should have. A movement that wasn't as efficient as before. Not slower, just different. As if something had caught her attention, not the target, the act itself. And once that happened, everything after it began to change. The strikes became less precise, not weaker, just less controlled. There were moments where she didn't move on immediately, moments where she stayed, where the silence lasted longer than it needed to. And then it became clear. This wasn't just execution anymore. Something else had entered it. Something that hadn't been there before. And far above, watching everything unfold, Ra began to notice it too. At first, he didn't react, because what he was seeing didn't make sense. She was still doing exactly what he had sent her to do. But the way she was doing it was no longer the same. And the longer he watched, the more obvious it became. This wasn't slowing down. This wasn't ending. It was continuing, without direction, without limit. And for the first time since he had released her, Ra understood something he hadn't expected. He hadn't created something that could finish a task. He had created something that didn't know how to stop. And once something like that starts, it doesn't correct itself. Chapter 4. When Justice Turned into Bloodlust. By now, there was no confusion left. What had started as correction had turned into something else. The land didn't feel restored. It felt emptied. Places that once held movement and noise were silent. Paths that were used daily were left untouched. And still, she moved through them. Sekhmet didn't change direction. She didn't return. She didn't wait for new orders. She continued. There was no longer any pattern to who she chose, no sign of judgment, no attempt to separate the guilty from the innocent. Only presence, followed by absence. And then something else began to appear. Not in the land, in the way she moved through it. Because the speed was no longer the same. At the beginning, everything had been immediate, precise, efficient. Now, there were moments where she slowed down. Not out of hesitation, not out of uncertainty, but as if there was no need to rush anymore. The urgency was gone. The outcome was already certain. And when that happens, the act itself begins to change. There were times when she didn't move on right away, times when she stayed longer than necessary. The silence after each moment stretched further, not because there was more to do, but because she wasn't leaving. And that's when it became undeniable. This wasn't about completing anything. This was something she had settled into. The repetition didn't weaken her, it deepened. Each movement carried the same force, but the intention behind it was no longer the same as before. And the longer it continued, the clearer it became. She wasn't just carrying out what she was made for. She had begun to respond to it. Not with thought, not with decision, but with something more instinctive, something that didn't come from Ra, something that had formed on its own. And once it appeared, it didn't fade. It stayed. It followed her from one place to the next. It shaped the way she moved, the way she remained. And the longer it stayed, the less this resembled anything controlled. Far above, Ra was no longer observing calmly, because what he was seeing now was not what he had created. The form was the same, the power was the same, but the purpose behind it had changed. And that was something he had no control over. Because whatever had taken hold wasn't something he had given her. And it wasn't something he could take back. Chapter 5. The moment Sekhmet stopped obeying Ra. By this point, Ra was no longer watching in silence. What had begun as a correction had gone far beyond its purpose. The land wasn't stabilizing, it was thinning. And for the first time since her creation, Ra intervened. He didn't need messengers. He didn't need distance. What he had created came from him, which meant it could still hear him. So he called her back. Not with uncertainty, not with doubt, with authority. The same force that had sent her into the world now reached out to pull her back. Stop. The command was clear, final, and for a moment, nothing changed. The wind still moved across the sand. The silence across the land remained. And Sekhmet continued. She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. There was no sign that the command had reached her. Ra spoke again, stronger this time, more direct. A command that had never been ignored before. Return. And again, nothing. This had never happened before, not once. No shift in her movement, no break in her pace, only continuation. And that was the moment everything changed. Because until now, there had still been a possibility that this could end, that it would correct itself, that it would slow down. But this was different. This was not a delay. This was refusal. Not spoken, not chosen in words, but clear. She was no longer responding to him. The connection that had created her was still there, but it wasn't controlling her anymore. And that had never happened before. Not to Ra. Not to anything he had ever made. For the first time, the god who ruled the sun had lost authority over his own creation. And below, nothing changed. Sekhmet didn't turn back. She didn't look upward. She didn't acknowledge anything beyond what was in front of her. Her movement remained steady, unbroken. And now, completely independent. Whatever had begun inside her had taken priority over everything else. Even him. And that meant something far more dangerous than disobedience. It meant there was no longer a limit. No command that could end this. No order that could slow it down. Nothing above her that could override what she had become. And once that became clear, the situation was no longer under control. It was unfolding. Chapter 6. The goddess who started enjoying the hunt. By now, this wasn't about control anymore. What had been created to correct a problem was now moving without any clear end. At first, the change had been subtle, easy to ignore, but it didn't stay that way. There were moments where Sekhmet didn't move on immediately. Moments where she remained in the same place longer than needed. Not because there was more to do, but because she wasn't ready to leave. And that's where the shift became impossible to ignore. Sekhmet was no longer just carrying out an action. She was beginning to respond to it. The pattern changed. Before, her movement had been direct, one place to the next, no delay, no variation. Now, there were pauses. Not hesitation, not uncertainty. Something else. She began to track movement instead of simply moving through it. She followed people instead of just arriving where they were. And that difference matters. Because tracking requires attention. It requires focus. It means the act is no longer automatic. It becomes deliberate. There were times when she adjusted her pace. Not to be faster, but to stay aligned with what was in front of her. And once that happens, the nature of what she's doing changes completely. This wasn't execution anymore. This was pursuit. And pursuit brings something with it that execution never does. Engagement. She wasn't just moving through the land anymore. She was interacting with it, responding to it. And the longer that continued, the clearer it became. She wasn't just continuing because she had been sent. She was continuing because something inside her had started to align with what she was doing. Not thought, not decision. Something deeper. Something that didn't need instructions. And once that takes hold, stopping becomes much harder than starting. Because now, the action feeds itself. The movement continues because it no longer depends on a command. It depends on momentum. And momentum doesn't ask whether it should continue. It just does. If you were there, watching this unfold, without understanding what was happening, you wouldn't describe it as chaos. You would describe it as something steady, something consistent. And that's what makes it worse. Because nothing about this looked out of control. It looked intentional. And that raises a different kind of question. Not whether she could stop, but whether she wanted to. And if the answer was no, then nothing above her mattered anymore. Think about that for a moment. At what point does something stop following its purpose and start following itself? Because that line had already been crossed, and no one had noticed when it happened. Chapter 7. When even the gods couldn't stop her. It didn't stay between Ra and Sekhmet for long. What was happening below had already gone too far to ignore. The land had changed. Not gradually, not subtly. Entire areas had gone quiet. Paths that once connected people were empty. There were no signs of movement, only signs that movement had stopped. And that kind of silence doesn't stay hidden. The other gods began to notice. At first, it was distance. Something felt off. The balance they were used to wasn't there anymore. Then it became visible. The absence. Not just fewer people, not just fewer voices. Whole regions where nothing responded at all. And once they understood the cause, their attention turned to her. Sekhmet. They already knew what she was. They understood what she had been created for. But this was no longer that. This wasn't a controlled force acting with purpose. This was something continuing without limit. And unlike Ra, they had no direct connection to her. Which meant one thing. They couldn't call her back. Still, they tried. Not with commands, with intervention. They moved through the same land she did, watched her patterns, tried to interrupt her path. But there was nothing to interrupt. She didn't follow a route. She didn't respond to presence. She moved as if nothing around her had any influence at all. And that made every attempt useless. There was no moment where she could be redirected, no pause where she could be reached, only continuation. And the more they observed, the more one detail became clear. She wasn't reacting to anything around her. She was driven entirely from within, which meant external force didn't matter. And that's a problem even for gods, because power only works when something can be affected by it. And she wasn't. At this point, the situation had moved beyond control. This wasn't about stopping her directly anymore. It was about understanding whether stopping her was even possible. And for the first time, the answer didn't look promising. Because nothing they tried made any difference. Not presence, not proximity, not power. And when every attempt fails, the question changes. It's no longer, how do we stop this? It becomes, how far does this go if we don't? And no one had an answer. Chapter 8. The plan to trick the bloodthirsty goddess. By this point, continuing like before wasn't an option. Trying to stop her directly had already failed. Trying to reach her had done nothing. Trying to control her wasn't possible anymore. So the question changed. If she couldn't be stopped, could she be redirected? That idea didn't come from confidence. It came from necessity. Because there was one thing they had started to understand. She wasn't reacting to commands. She wasn't reacting to presence. But she was reacting to what was in front of her. Her movement had become focused, not on people as individuals, but on something more specific. The act itself. And if that was true, then maybe that focus could be used, not against her, but around her. The plan wasn't built on power, it was built on observation. What had she been responding to? What had kept her moving without pause? And once they understood that, the idea became clear. She didn't need to be stopped. She needed to be given something else to continue with. Something that would hold her attention, something that would not run out, something that would keep her occupied long enough for everything else to survive. But it had to be convincing, not similar, not close, exact. Because if she recognized the difference, even for a moment, there would be no second attempt. And that's what made this plan dangerous. There was no margin for error. Either it worked completely, or it failed immediately. So they prepared it carefully, not in small amounts, not as a test. Across the land, they spread it where she moved, where she would arrive, where she would not be able to avoid it. A liquid, colored to match exactly what had been driving her. Deep, dense, indistinguishable. And then they stepped back, because once it was in place, there was nothing left to adjust. No second chance to correct it. No way to intervene halfway through. Now, everything depended on one moment. The moment she reached it. And what she would do when she did. Chapter 9. The night everything shifted. Nothing moved for a while. The land had been prepared. Everything was in place. And then she arrived. Sekhmet stepped into it the same way she had moved through everything else. No hesitation, no change in pace. At first, nothing seemed different. She continued forward, the same direction, the same movement. And then, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to notice. Her pace slowed, not because something stopped her, but because something caught her attention. For the first time in all of this, her movement adjusted to what was around her. The ground beneath her wasn't dry. It held something. A deep red surface spreading across the land, still, heavy. And it didn't move away from her. She stepped into it. There was no reaction at first, just contact. Then a pause, a longer one than before. And then she lowered her head, not cautiously, not carefully, naturally, as if this was exactly what she'd been moving toward the entire time. She took the first drink. Nothing changed immediately. No sudden shift. No visible reaction. And that's what made it uncertain. Because there was no way to tell if this had worked, or if it had done nothing at all. She drank again. This time, longer. And then again. Each time with less pause in between. The movement became more focused, more committed. She stayed where she was, no longer moving across the land, no longer searching. Everything had narrowed to this one point. And for the first time since this began, the rest of the world was no longer part of her movement. Only this. And still, no one moved. Because this was the moment everything depended on. If this failed, there would be nothing left to save. If this failed, there was nothing left to try. She continued. The rhythm changed. No longer steady movement across distance. Now it was repetition in place. Drink. Pause. Drink again. And then something began to shift. Not outside, inside. Her movement became less precise. Not weaker, not slower in strength, but less controlled in direction. Her balance adjusted. The pauses between each action changed, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. And then the first real break appeared. A step that didn't land exactly where it should have. A shift in posture that hadn't been there before. And that's when it became clear. Something was finally affecting her. But it still wasn't certain how far it would go. Because even now, she didn't stop. She continued to drink. And that raised a different question. Not whether the plan had worked, but whether it would work in time. Chapter 10. The moment everything finally stopped. By this point, there was no way to look away from what was happening. Every movement, every shift in her balance, every change in rhythm carried meaning, because this was the first time since her creation that something had begun to interfere with her. Sekhmet remained where she was, no longer moving across the land, no longer searching, no longer continuing the pattern that had carried her from place to place without pause. Everything had narrowed into a single point. She continued to drink, But the consistency that had defined her until now was no longer there. Her movements lost their exactness. Her posture shifted more than it should have. Her balance adjusted in ways that no longer matched the precision she had shown before. At first, it was subtle enough that it could have been ignored. But it didn't stay subtle. Each movement began to take more effort to complete. Not because she lacked strength, but because the control behind that strength was starting to break apart. She stepped forward again, but the step didn't land cleanly. She corrected herself, but the correction wasn't immediate. And for the first time since this began, there was a delay between action and response. That delay mattered, because it meant something had finally interrupted the continuity that had made her unstoppable. She lowered her head again, continuing the same action that had held her in place, but now the rhythm was uneven. The pauses stretched longer, the movements overlapped. The sequence that had once been exact was now unstable. And then the shift became undeniable. She tried to move forward, not to leave, not to return, but simply to continue as she had before. But this time, her body didn't respond the same way. The movement started, but it didn't complete. The direction held for a moment and then broke. She adjusted again, attempting to regain the same steady motion that had carried her across the land without interruption. But the alignment was gone. And once that alignment breaks, it doesn't return easily. Her stance widened to compensate. Her balance shifted again. The control that had defined her from the moment she was created was no longer holding everything together. And then it happened. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once. She stopped. Not because she chose to, not because she was commanded to, but because she couldn't continue in the same way anymore. The momentum that had driven her forward without limit had finally been interrupted. She remained standing for a moment longer, but even that stability didn't last. Her posture weakened, not in strength, but in coordination. The precision was gone. The control was gone. And without those, the force she carried could no longer sustain itself. She lowered again, not in movement, but in collapse. The same ground that had held her attention now held her completely. And for the first time since Ra had released her into the world, everything stopped. The movement across the land ended. The pattern that had spread without limit broke. The continuation that no one could interrupt finally came to an end. But not because she chose to stop, and not because she was stopped by force. It ended because something had interfered with the only thing that had been driving her forward. And once that was disrupted, there was nothing left to carry it on. Above it all, Ra watched as the force he had released finally came to rest. Not destroyed, not removed, just no longer moving. And even in that stillness, one thing remained clear. This had not been controlled. This had not been contained. It had simply run its course. Chapter 11. From Destroyer to Healer. The Transformation of Sekhmet. For a long time, nothing moved. The land, which had been defined by constant motion, by continuous progression, by a force that never paused, was now still in a way it hadn't been since this began. Sekhmet remained where she had fallen, her presence no longer spreading across the land, no longer shaping everything around her. But the stillness didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something waiting. Because nothing about what had happened suggested that this could simply be over. The force that had driven her had not been removed. It had not been taken away or undone. It had only been interrupted. And interruption is not the same as resolution. Time passed, though it was difficult to measure. Nothing in the land moved the way it had before, and nothing returned immediately to what it had been. And then, slowly, something changed again. Not in the land, in her. The same form remained, the same presence, but the intensity that had defined every movement was no longer there. The stillness was no longer unstable. It had settled. And when she finally moved again, the difference was clear. There was no urgency behind it, no continuation of what had come before. The movement was controlled again. But not in the same way, because before, control had come from direction, from purpose given to her. Now, it came from something internal, something that had shifted during that interruption. She stood, but the force that had driven her forward without limit was no longer present in the same way. And for the first time since her creation, there was no immediate continuation, no next target, no next movement already forming. Only presence. And that presence began to change how she was understood. Because what had once been feared as something that could only destroy was now being approached in a different way. Not as something to escape, but as something to face. And slowly, that shift extended beyond her. The same force that had brought destruction was now seen as something that could also hold back what it once released. Not because it had been replaced, but because it had changed. She became something people could turn to, not with certainty, but with recognition. Because if something could cause that level of harm, it could also understand it. And that idea changed everything. The force that had moved without limit was now something that could be approached with caution instead of fear alone. And over time, that became something more structured. A transformation not just in what she did, but in what she represented. From something that could not be stopped to something that needed to be acknowledged. And eventually, something that could be asked for help. She was no longer seen only as the force that had nearly ended everything. She became something more complex, a presence that carried both sides of what had happened. And that dual nature remained, because nothing about what she had done was erased. Nothing about what she had been was removed. It was still there, just no longer unchecked. And that difference is what allowed everything else to continue. Chapter 12. Why Ancient Egypt Feared and Worshipped Her. What happened didn't disappear. Even after everything became still again, The memory of it stayed in the land, in the people, and in the way they understood what they were living under. Because nothing about what they had witnessed felt distant. It didn't feel like something that had happened once and was gone. It felt possible. Sekhmet was no longer moving across the land the way she had before, but the force she carried had not been forgotten, and people didn't treat that lightly. They didn't speak about her as something that had been defeated. They didn't believe she had been removed. They understood her as something that still existed, which meant the way they lived had to change around that understanding. Because if something like that could happen once, there was no reason it couldn't happen again. And that idea shaped everything. People didn't ignore her. They didn't try to distance themselves from what she represented. They acknowledged it. In their homes, in their routines, in the way they approached illness, danger, and uncertainty, her presence was part of how they explained what they couldn't control. When sickness spread, it wasn't random. When the heat became unbearable, it wasn't just weather. These were understood as expressions of the same force they had already seen. And that changed how they responded. Because if the same force could bring destruction, it could also be the only thing that could stop it. That logic became part of daily life. People didn't only fear her, they relied on her. They asked for protection from the very thing they believed she controlled. And that might seem contradictory at first, but it wasn't. Because from their perspective, it made sense. If something had the ability to cause harm, then it also had the ability to hold it back. And that made her presence unavoidable. Not something you could reject, not something you could ignore. Something you had to recognize. Because ignoring it had already proven to be dangerous. And over time, that recognition became structured. Not in the form of control, but in the form of routine. People built their lives around the understanding that balance wasn't guaranteed. It had to be maintained. And maintaining it meant constantly acknowledging the force that could disrupt it. That's why she was feared. But it's also why she was respected. Because what they had learned wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what could happen when something powerful continued without limit. And that understanding stayed with them, not as a story, as a warning. If you were living there, knowing what had already happened, would you treat her as something distant, or something you needed to stay aware of every single day? Chapter 13. The festival that kept the goddess calm. What happened with Sekhmet didn't just change how people thought, it changed what they did. Because remembering wasn't enough. Knowing what she was capable of didn't protect anyone on its own. If the force that had nearly ended everything was still present, then awareness had to become action. And over time, that action became something organized. Not a single event, not a small ritual. Something repeated. Something shared. Something large enough that it felt like a response to what had happened. It became a festival. but not the kind built only for celebration. This had a purpose. The idea behind it was simple, but very deliberate. If Sekhmet had once been stopped by something that held her attention, then that same idea could be repeated. Not to stop her again, but to make sure it never reached that point. So they recreated it. Across the land, people gathered, not quietly, not cautiously, together. Drinks were prepared carefully, not randomly, not without thought. They were made to resemble exactly what had once drawn her in. The colour mattered, the consistency mattered. Everything about it was intentional. And people didn't just prepare it, they consumed it. Not in small amounts, not casually, in large numbers. Because this wasn't about individuals, it was about scale. Music filled the space. Movement replaced stillness. Noise replaced silence. The same land that had once gone quiet was now active again. And that contrast mattered, because what they were doing wasn't just symbolic, it was controlled release. Instead of waiting for something to build without limit, they created a way for it to be expressed safely. They didn't remove the force. They didn't pretend it didn't exist. They engaged with it. And that made all the difference. Because ignoring something powerful doesn't make it disappear. But acknowledging it, understanding it, and building around it can change how it behaves. The festival wasn't about distraction. It was about maintaining balance. And over time, it became something expected. Something that returned again and again. Not because people forgot what had happened, but because they remembered it clearly. And they understood that what had once required a desperate solution should never be allowed to reach that point again. If you think about it, this wasn't just a celebration. It was a system. A way to deal with something dangerous before it became uncontrollable again. Chapter 14. What Sekhmet really represents and why it still matters. By now, the story isn't just about what happened. It's about what it showed. Because nothing in this story came from nowhere. What happened with Sekhmet didn't begin as chaos. It began as control. A problem appeared. A solution was created. And at first, that solution worked exactly as intended. That's what makes it important. Because the turning point didn't happen when she was created. It happened later. It happened when the action continued, even after the purpose was gone. And that's something people understood. Not as a distant idea, but as something they could recognize in different forms. Because the pattern is simple. Something is created to solve a problem. It works. It becomes effective. And then it keeps going. Past the point where it's needed. Past the point where it makes sense. And by the time anyone notices, it's already difficult to stop. That's what Sekhmet represents. Not just destruction, not just power. Continuation without limit. And that's why the story stayed, because it wasn't only about a goddess, It was about a pattern people could see again. In nature, in people, in systems. Anything that starts with a purpose, but doesn't know when to end. And once you notice that pattern, it's hard to ignore, because it shows up in ways that don't look dramatic at first. It builds slowly, it spreads quietly, and then, at some point, it becomes obvious. But by then, it's already in motion. And that's the part people remembered. Not just what she did, but how it happened. How something controlled became uncontrolled. How something directed became independent. How something created to protect became something that consumed. That shift is what stayed with them. And it's what makes the story still relevant. Because nothing about that pattern is limited to one place or one time. It can happen anywhere. And it often does. If you think about it, the real question isn't whether something like Sekhmet could exist again. It's whether we would recognize it before it reaches the point where it can't be stopped. Epilogue. The danger that still exists today. At the beginning of this story, there was a simple idea. Something was created to protect the world, and it nearly ended it instead. What made it dangerous wasn't how powerful it was. It was the fact that it didn't know when to stop. And that part hasn't changed. Because that same pattern still exists. Not as a goddess walking across the land, but in the way things continue past their purpose. In systems that keep expanding. In actions that don't slow down. In decisions that feel right at the start, and then go too far. That's what makes this story last. Not because of what happened back then, but because the same question still applies now. When something begins to go too far, would we recognize it in time? Or would we only notice once it's already out of control? And maybe that's why this story was never meant to be forgotten. Not as a warning about gods, but as a reminder about limits and what happens when they disappear. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more mythic stories like this, and share your thoughts below. And before you go, tell me where you listened to this from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Until the next story, stay curious. Yours, Lady Mythos.